Hi, this is The Basics, a multi-part series about all the basics to do with photography. Everything from what is a camera and how do I hold it, all the way up to how do I do post-processing. It'll be both in this studio as well as beyond these walls in the field. Join me. Okay, welcome to lesson 4. Today we're going to be talking about shutter speed. So we've talked about the entire exposure triangle. We've talked about shutter speed versus aperture versus ISO. We've talked in detail about ISO, and now we're going to talk in detail about shutter speed. So typically shutter speed is going to be 1 over some number, let's say 100. So, and it's measured in fractions of a second. Now, cameras will typically have a range of shutter speeds. So often you will find 30 seconds at the high end and something like a 4,000th of a second at the low end. So just as with ISO, one side is brighter, one side is dimmer. So in this case, our dimmer and darker side is the faster shutter speed, and our brighter side is the longer shutter speed. Okay, and just as with ISO, the other parts of the triangle do affect the shutter speed that we need, and therefore part of the shutter speeds we can use is determined by what we set the other things to. So when it comes to shutter speed, unlike ISO, we don't have an effect of noise based on how long our shutter speed is. Generally speaking, that's not how we like to think about it. What we like to think about shutter speed as, when we're considering photographs, is that this smooths motion and this halts motion. Okay? So if we imagine, say, this line we're traveling, let's say it gets here in 1/10 of a second. Okay? If we capture an image over 1/5 of a second, we're going to see a smear. So in our camera, because our shutter is open for this amount of time, we'll see all of that happen. So we won't get a single line, we'll get a smear of that line. Now if we go down to a shutter speed of 1/10 of a second, we'll only see it till it gets to that point. And if we went further and further, eventually we'll get down to the point where it can't get any smaller, and therefore we don't see any of that blur. So one of the key things that shutter speed changes is motion blur. Now, there are a number of scenarios, as we discussed in our ISO lesson. If we're shooting sports, we want to halt the motion. We want to avoid motion blur because that's not what we're trying to see. We're trying to see the thing that's happening, the action that's happening in front of us. So in sports, we want a faster shutter speed. Why might we want a longer shutter speed? Well, typically we're going to want a longer shutter speed in order to show that motion, right? We're talking about photos, and photos inherently are a static, two-dimensional representation of the world. And if we want to show that something is moving, we want to give the impression of motion, that motion blur is important. So what we'll do is we'll use longer shutter speeds, We'll use longer shutter speeds, and that will give us the impression that something is moving. You'll see longer shutter speeds typically being used on things like running water because it smooths it out. It makes it a lot more visually pleasant. There are people who obviously are on the other side of the spectrum when it comes to moving water. It depends on the scenario. Experiment and find out for yourself what you enjoy. There are also situations where you might think that we would want to use a very high shutter speed. For example, if you've seen photos of race cars where the car is moving and the car appears perfectly sharp in the frame, and then the background is completely blurred out. That's a technique known as panning, where you follow the car with the camera and you have a longer shutter speed so it blurs everything in the background, but if you follow it at just the right speed, you can make sure that the car is in focus and nice and crisp, but everything is blurred in the background, and that also gives us that impression of motion and speed, right? So selecting your shutter speed is important not just for getting your exposure value right, but it is also important for getting the aesthetics of your shot. Now, one thing I do want to mention before we end this relatively short little diatribe on shutter speed is there is a technique called ICM, and ICM stands for intentional camera movement. And what ICM does is it's very similar to that panning, although it's a broader category. You use a higher, longer shutter speed, but you move the camera intentionally, thus the eye. You move the camera in order to produce an effect. Now, one of the more common ways of doing ICM is what's called light painting. So if you have a long exposure and you move a light around, you can paint with that light. It's often used as kind of a cool effect in videos. So, ICM, that's a additional technique that you can add to your repertoire once you understand how your shutter speed works. That's it for this lesson. I'll see you when I see you.